And I asked the people who were there, have you read and understood the Chinese version? They said, no, it had been certified. I said, we must read it. And we must get our own independent translator to tell us what it says. When we gave it, the Chinese version was completely different from the English version. Did I blame the Chinese? No, I didn't blame them. It is us. In other words, one cannot quarrel against foreign direct investment. The world is a global village, but every country must take care of our interests. The problem with many African countries is that we don't take care of our African interests. In many African countries, people travel for a very technical meeting, but 3/4 of the delegations are politicians. In many European and Asian countries, you'll find there'll be 1 or 2 politicians and 10 technocrats, so they can hold meetings throughout the night. Going forward, one is therefore saying, for example, if we have Chinese or French or any other people in the mining industry, we must enter into agreements that are very clear, because we don't have the technology. You will install your equipment, we'll even give you tax holidays for 10 years, but within that period, we want to see that there is transfer of technology. If we are dealing with diamond, we want to have developed to the level where we can produce cut diamond and we can export it from here. In other words, I'm saying foreign direct investment is good, but we must define what it is that we want. When I talk about benchmarking, particularly in areas of governance within the region, they are very realistic. This idea that a delegation of Zimbabwean civil servants and Zimbabwean politicians have gone to Brasilia in Brazil for purposes of learning how to govern themselves invariably is per diem driven. And I've chosen Brasilia because it is the farthest from Zimbabwe, and therefore if you look at the per diem, they are the highest. Yet if you went to Botswana across the border, you would discover that the levels are more realistic, the culture is comparable, and that therefore benchmarking must be determined by your real and actual needs. But one, and I'll conclude by giving the example of Ethiopia. Ethiopia in 1984 had no more than 2,000 installed power in terms of megawatts. Within 10 years, within 20 years, and in many of these, like they are doing the Grand Renaissance Dam, most of the financing is the Ethiopian diaspora. And right now, by the end of this year, Ethiopia will have an installed capacity of nearly 20,000 megawatts. When you are talking about 20,000 megawatts and you are talking industrialization, then I know you are talking business. But when you are talking 1,000 megawatts and you are talking industrialization, that is the power that drives the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam. You are industrializing in poultry farming. Exactly. So, in other words, those, like the Honorable Minister, people who are in government will tell you, and I want to imagine this is the kind of conversation that goes on in cabinet. We are talking industrialization. What are the sources of energy? How are we going to industrialize? The other thing that I just want to mention, we are talking about water, because water is going to be a crisis in the next 10 years, just water. And these, to me, therefore, inform the question, the difference between other civilizations and us Africans, and we must say it. Many times we don't define what we want. Many times we leave too many things to God. You know, God is not in that business. God is not in the business of providing manna from heaven. Manna is here. God has given us manna, use it. It is the mind. And the blame game, I did not mention during my presentation the significance of private sector. The private sector is at the very heart of it. And the beauty of it is that many of you, as I look at many of you here, you have a wealth of experience. How does government use individuals who are experienced, individuals who are in retirement? Does the government have a deliberate policy of going back to these individuals who perhaps don't need a salary? They just need recognition and egos to be pampered, to be told that they were consulted, and they can say it at dinner parties that have now been consulted by government. And then you consult them for free. So African governments must have that deliberate policy of using individuals and using institutions. And very lastly, universities. If you look at the major innovations that are taking place in Europe and America right now, and even in China, it is the universities that must be enabled. When there is no research, when universities have become certificate issuing institutions and no research is taking place, then you know that university is truly an ivory tower. The linkage between university, the linkage between research, private sector, and government is at the very heart of the revival of the economy. And I have no doubt in my mind, if you go to the universities here in Zimbabwe, at very minimal cost, you can actually commission departments in economics, departments in agriculture, departments in law, departments in medicine, to do some work. And that work is then used for purposes of informing government policy. And invariably, you send people to Harvard to tell us how to govern ourselves in Gweru, and others to Oxford to tell us how to govern ourselves in Bulawayo, how to run our parliament. You can't get it, because as long as you ask the wrong questions, you'll always get the wrong answers. And I'm submitting to us that that is part of our problem. And the Honorable Minister here will know, for example, in the legal regime, part of every other activities requires a legal infrastructure. Even when we talk about foreign direct investment, one of the critical things that people ask, suppose I come to Zimbabwe and there is a dispute, will it be resolved quickly? Right now, one of the things that make Zimbabwe unattractive is when you have earned your profits in Zimbabwe, will you repatriate the money? And the answer is no, for the moment. And even if you do, with great difficulty. I'm not an economist, but I know that if there is one area on which Zimbabwe is in the high dependency unit, is in the monetary sector, the fiscal policy, and that is one of the areas that I think that Zimbabwe will want to work within the region in a manner that I know they know better than I. It is not for me to prescribe, but I think that that is urgent business. I have been deliberately listening to your new Minister for Finance and to your president since they were inaugurated, because Africa is my pet subject. And I'm listening, I want to know, when will you de-dollarize the economy? Because when you dollarize and go into a currency whose volume you do not control, you create parallel economies. And therefore you have an economy. I don't like to call black economies black, because it means it's bad. You have a parallel economy. And when you have a parallel economy competing with government, then the reality is that the government will always suffer, the tax base thins out, and everybody is discovering new ways of avoiding taxation and avoiding government. When you are traveling, you keep money everywhere to ensure that it is concealed and can never be found, even when they put those machines on you, including your elbows and other areas. And you succeed half of the time. Thank you.
Professor.